if the drug is indeed rescheduled to a Schedule 3, how will rescheduling fundamentally change the business models of the current MSO operators? Hey everyone, welcome to our latest TDR Cannabis Exclusive. Thanks for checking in. This industry, as we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, red hot right now. A lot of questions pertaining to rescheduling, how it works. A lot of people asking questions. Is this going to happen? Is that going to happen? Is this true? Is this a myth? Well, we want to learn more. And one of the main reasons why we're having on great guest here today is to answer a lot of these questions. So we welcome in, he's the head of global U.S. sector groups for cannabis, from Dentons, based out of Chicago, is Eric Berlin. Good to see you, sir. How are things?
Things are great. Thank you for having me on, and nice to speak with you and Rob.
Yes, there's a list of questions. Many of our viewers are asking a lot. I don't know how to answer them, but I think in due time, they'll get some pretty simplistic stuff that they'll better understand what we can expect moving forward. As well, let's welcome in President and Manager of the Pluralist Capital Group, Rob Sechrist. Good to see you again, sir. How are things?
Good. Thanks for having us and Eric with us. And Eric has been instrumental in our strategy of everything that we do. And maybe he can touch on some of that stuff from his broader background. But and even in the most recent securitization, we couldn't have gotten it done without him.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. I was proud of the work, and it was amazing project.
Eric, you're considered in the industry about the smartest attorney when it comes to cannabis. And I know there's a lot of people that are all excited. They got the pom-poms on again, looking at rescheduling, what this could potentially do for the overall industry. But, let's walk before we run. So if the drug is indeed rescheduled to a Schedule 3, how will rescheduling fundamentally change the business models of the current MSO operators?
The most significant change to their operations would be relief from the 280E tax.
Right. Okay.
That state legal operators would be taxed like normal tax-paying citizens. Beyond that, there would not be significant immediate impacts. I think that the rescheduling is very significant. And I understand that some people are disappointed that we're not headed toward a descheduling, and it's probably not fair to talk about any cannabis issue without, acknowledging the social equity issues and the social justice issues. But let me put that to the side, because I think realistically, in terms of what the FDA was tasked with, probably a Schedule 3 was as good as the industry is going to get. And while there's not immediate large impacts, it's important in that it's the first time in decades, after decades of denial, that our federal government has acknowledged that cannabis has generally accepted medical uses in the U.S. So that it's an important step, even though it doesn't have those immediate huge impacts in the industry.
Interesting. Rob, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think that what's so important about what Eric is saying is that there are 45,000 license holders across the nation currently, as of our latest poll, and about 30,000 unique owners of those licenses. And maybe you could opine on this a little bit more, Eric, is that in our estimates that, we're looking at somewhere around 40% or so of additional revenue by being able to write off your expenses at the federal level. And why this is so impactful is this affects every single one of those 30,000 business owners and 45,000 license holders across the entire country in the same tax year. And I would suspect that when they put it out, that it's retroactively for the whole tax year, how I would think they would do it. We'll have to see. But my main point is that this impacts every single business across the entire scope of everything at once.
Yeah, we've seen some numbers out there suggesting the millions of dollars that could be saved for these businesses. Yeah, let me share my perspective. Now, I've been saying all along that any 280E relief would be we'd be happy to end the year with that. An absolutely enormous victory for the state legal cannabis industry. Because of those, it's really, for many companies, changing the bottom line, right?
For sure.
And so for a long time, capital into the industry was somewhat held up. I mean, we did lots of interesting creative things to attract capital, but there were some limits of just folks saying, we want to see these businesses profit. And this is the lifeline that allows that, right? I mean, this is going to have important impacts on profit margins, which in turn will make businesses more attractive, which in turn will attract capital into the industry. And I was saying that like day of, and I don't need to have conjecture anymore. We have the stock market to prove that that actually is correct. I mean, people have been very attracted to this notion.
So let's one part I want to bring up this, and this is great, really some interesting information that we got from some of our viewers that we reached out to, and that is I want to find out whether this is a myth or there's actual truth to what some of these statements are. So I want to begin. Rescheduling to 3 will eliminate state medical cannabis. Is that correct, or is that a myth?
Incorrect. What I anticipate is that state medical cannabis programs will continue to exist on separate rails under separate state laws. There will be impacts over time, but understand there's not like rescheduling to 3 doesn't provide a good alternative yet. And so it's important because it will allow research to harness the plant's potential,
Yep.
but it doesn't yet provide immediate relief to patients. So I anticipate that state medical cannabis programs will continue for certainly the near future, if not even the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Rob, you brought up some interesting stuff last week too, and it was just about how like maybe elaborate a little bit on the prosecution conversation that we had from both the medical and recreational states, and to
Yeah.
clarify that and what that meant.
Yeah, I was actually going back and forth with Eric on some of this. Is that that the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer amendment will still be in place, and Eric and I were going back and forth on that, and maybe Eric, you could just kind of reframe that up of that amendment still remains in place, and maybe you could extrapolate out a little bit more what our conversation was back and forth.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Rob, and thanks for introducing the concept. So for now 8 years, there has not been any federal enforcement against state legal entities or their vendors or their investors, right? And so there's been that large prosecutorial discretion. First of all, I would expect that to continue for now. And I don't know who our next president will be or all that, but I expect that to continue. There is in place what was originally the Rohrabacher-Farr. I think now it's the Joyce Amendment, but it says that it in the appropriations bill gives money to the DOJ, but says DOJ, you may not use any of this money to do anything that would interfere with state medical cannabis programs. Well, that has been interpreted to mean that the DOJ may not bring a prosecution against any entity or person that is in strict compliance with medical cannabis laws, state medical cannabis laws. So largely there's been discretion arising from that and other DOJ discretion. The question I raised with Rob is, it's hard for me to even imagine how the DOJ would execute a prosecution against a company in one of these states without interfering with the medical cannabis program.
Right.
I mean, and let's be clear,
Why is that, Eric? Can you explain that just so people understand?
Yeah, well, almost every adult use program, I think every adult use program has grown up out of a medical cannabis program.
Mm-hmm.
So you start with medical cannabis. All the operators that started are licensed with medical. There are some operators that are purely adult use, but even them are so integrated into the system that how do you prosecute one without having a negative effect, without interfering with a state medical cannabis program? I'm not saying here today that it's impossible. What I'm saying here today is I see many, many impediments to doing that. And I suspect the DOJ does as well. And I suspect they will continue not to prosecute companies that are in compliance with medical cannabis laws and compliance with, the adult use laws in that state. There may be, as time goes on, at any point the FDA, for example, could start intervening into the state legal cannabis programs. Yeah. They're in Health and Human Services. The appropriations bill doesn't apply to them. They have limited resources to do so, though. and the risks are less than, a DOJ criminal prosecution. So there are various things that could happen in the future, but it just seems difficult to interfere with the state legal industry as it stands right now.
Yeah.
And Chad, if I could just add a little follow on, most people may or may not be aware of this, but when you have a medical licensed state only, and then it switches to recreational, the medical license sales almost effectively go away because nobody's going to put up their medical card because there's no benefit to showing it. So the sales skew going recreational, whether they're being utilized for medical or not. There's
Right.
no reason to show that anymore. You're not getting a credit or a different pricing or insurance coverage. And so that's something that I think that it has to be distinguished. And then in a lot of states, there is no differentiation between the medical product and the recreational product until the point of sale, because that product is so all the way down the line. They don't know which way it's going to go until it's bought by the customer.
Right.
I jumping on that, Rob, I'd like to see states have laws that basically say if the federal government does anything to try to stop or interfere with the adult use program, the entire adult use program is triggered to medical, and any person can self-certify at the point of sale. That's our new medical cannabis program.
Wow. Eric.
So, I mean, yeah, I'm aggressive, but keep in mind, when I started 15 years ago, there were like 3 states that had medical cannabis programs. So
Right.
you have to be a little bit aggressive to push this forward.
There's another sentiment around the investor community that if and when this does get rescheduled to a Schedule 3, that there's a lot of facilities that need to be upgraded to be like CPM or CPG.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are saying like some of these facilities aren't up to speed, therefore they're not going to be available. But I don't look at this as, people want to go to cannabis dispensaries. They're going to buy obviously product from cannabis dispensaries. But how do you see that all playing out with regards to facilities and if and when Schedule 3 were to happen and how that could change potentially?
So this is where we get, either it's good news or bad news, depending on what perspective you have. If in fact the DEA does reschedule to 3, and we should comment that that's not a done deal. That is, I think politically I look at it, it's likely to happen. And I can talk about this a little bit more, but it's not a done deal. But if the DEA reschedules to 3, on day one, not one of the state legal operators would be federally legal. The entire programs and all of the operators would still be federally legal because none of them would be DEA registered.
Correct.
What I'm suggesting to you is that the federal government is not going to require that right away for the state programs, that the state programs will exist essentially on separate rails. If a company wants to, there are lots of ways to do this, right? One way is to form a separate company that enters into a federally legal pathway, right? You're doing federally legal research. It leaves you a little bit of optionality in years to come. The reason I say that is because on number one, those companies are not legal because they're not DEA registered. The DEA has originally said we're not going to register companies that are violating federal law, even if they're state legal.
Right.
That may or may not change. The other thing I'd say though is there are lots of companies that are nowhere near being able to get like DEA registered in terms of their ISO compliance, CGMP, and just what the expectations are on security and that sort of thing. And there are many companies that wouldn't want to, right? They just would say,
why is that? Rob, I see you nodding your head too. You're agreeing with that.
Yeah, well, we financed the first DEA federally licensed facility. And Shad, I think you went there with us.
Yeah.
And that as a GMP certified facility, but the level of security and the level of all the certifications that are necessary for that level of certification are orders of magnitude higher than a traditional recreational / state medical program facility, which are still massively, lot of regulatory compliance. But when you go to the federal, it's so insane that the price per pound goes up to like $7,000 a pound, as opposed to for wholesale, as opposed to what the market rate is currently for the state programs for the equivalent of being, $1,200 to $1,400 a pound.
Wow, big difference.
Smile, because I love that Rob has all that at the top of his head. It's correct, yes, and I think that I'm not saying none can, and I'm certainly not saying none will. I'm just saying that on day one, none will be federally licensed, and some will want to, and others will say, I never want to jump through those hoops. I'm happy just to be here in this state. And some states have security requirements that come much closer to the federal requirements. Other states don't. So there'll be a lot of, it creates optionality, I think it creates more optionality, quite frankly.
There's one other, go ahead.
No, that's it.
There's one other thing to note. The DEA program specifically stipulates you cannot be a state license holder. You can't be in the same facility, can't be in the same address, can't have anything associated with it. And in fact, the federal facilities aren't even in the green zone of where all the rest of the state facilities are that are required to be licensed. They're outside of that.
Right. These facilities that you referred to that, aren't fully upgraded to be approved by, the DEA, so to speak. Are these companies like from all different sizes, like from private companies to big pubco companies? Like, what is this across the board that people are unfamiliar with?
I won't comment on any one company. I think
I'm not looking for
many.
names.
Yeah, no, I understand. I'm saying there are many companies that are well ahead of other companies, right? And so I think there are companies that probably have the ability to, meet DEA requirements.
Okay.
What I'm suggesting is there are many that don't. I mean, there are many right now in the industry that are struggling to meet the state requirements because capital is so slim, and it's a terrible situation. Now, going back, 280E relief would be wonderful for that, would help that, and hopefully really be good for the industry. But whether they then say, "Oh, I want to become part of the limited federal supply," folks are going to have to make a decision as to what the future looks like and try to position themselves well.
And Chad, one of the facilities you went to as well has conformed to federal levels, and FDA level compliance was the co-packer that we took you to. So they've already gone ahead and certified at that level, self-certified to be compliant day one, if and when this ever happens.
Yeah, I said DEA, I meant to say FDA, but that's interesting to say the least, as we, again, this is all about understanding the whole process, right? And right now, I think we have a lot of retail investors that are just super excited. And it's just like, let's walk before we run. Next question I wanted to bring up, we actually learned this from Don Murphy, lobbyist, earlier this summer, about how big pharma just does not care. They're not even watching this industry. So rescheduling to Schedule 3 hands the entire industry to big pharma, which is a big myth, right, Eric?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think that it wouldn't make the state programs legal, as we said, but we would expect the state programs to exist and to continue. So it's not handing them to anyone, and the pharma programs aren't entering that. It would enable any number of companies, right? I mean, let's be clear. Cannabis research is being done across the world, but not that much in the United States because of these limits. And it's not handing anything to big pharma. There are two issues. One is, if you want to just get access to cannabis legally, safe, legal, affordable access has increased dramatically in the last 10 years. I mean, amazingly dramatically. I can sit now in Illinois and walk to my dispensary, right? And that didn't exist when I started, and everyone told me it would be impossible. So it's much better. That will continue to exist. What hopefully will happen now is we will harness this plant for greater health and well-being, right? I mean, if we can actually, and this is a long-term issue, right? I mean, this isn't in 1 year or 2 years. It's going to take time. But to enter that research and to understand how to use this better for better health and well-being, all sorts of issues. And we may have, I've researched this myself very thoroughly. This is a safe product. This is a safe substance. That's based on what we know now, right? As we study more, we may see epigenetic indications that will educate us about how to use this drug and hopefully integrate it better into our lives as opposed to farther away from our lives. So I see this all as a good thing. And the more educated people become about cannabis and the more willing they are to use it, I mean, that's good for state operators as well.
Yeah, I think the positive sentiment in the last couple of weeks in this industry is that we've seen this sort of song and dance before. It just feels different this time. And I don't want to be the guy that's the cheerleader because, yes, there's still a lot of things that we have to figure out, but we live in a society now where everybody wants everything done like yesterday in such a short period of time. And that's all part of the growing pains of emerging industry. Last question I'll ask. I don't know if you had anything specifically, Rob, but FDA is rescheduling medical cannabis, but they cannot reschedule recreational cannabis. Is this true or a myth?
That also is a myth. And let me be clear as to what the process is now. This all exists under statutory authority and regulatory authority. So it's not like the FDA can just do whatever it wants. And I understand, I hear loud and clear the frustration that we're not headed toward a descheduling.
Yeah.
And I personally think that cannabis should be descheduled and regulated in a sensible, uniform way along the way. But the FDA had narrow guidelines, basically an 8-step test to evaluate cannabis. And I thought pretty much the best we were going to do was 3. So I think it's wonderful that they're recognizing its medicinal uses and its lower risk profile. That recommendation goes to the DEA.
Mm-hmm.
The DEA analyzes that recommendation, but also has its own 5-part test. And then it can consider more. It has fairly broad authority. And so I tend to believe if the FDA transmitted that letter, everyone's on the same page and the DEA will reschedule to 3.
You do believe that?
I do believe that. Yes.
Wow.
So let me address that. I know we're nearing time, but
okay.
I do believe that. But I also want to point out that they don't have to do that. And we could, I mean, this is horrible to say. I hate to even articulate it. The DEA, I mean, I suppose they'll get sued if they do it, but the DEA could come back and say, can't do it. We're going to keep it at 1, or we're going to keep it at 2 because we think that we have to comply with international law under the Single Convention. And that's where I disagree with the DEA. My group has looked at this very, very closely from every angle, and we're absolutely convinced the DEA can move cannabis to Schedule 3, still in compliance with the Single Convention. They just have to implement a few additional regulations that are fully within their authority to do. And so cannabis can be scheduled to 3 in compliance with basically all applicable laws with some adjustments. And I think they can do that. And I'm hopeful that given the political pressure to do that, that's what we'll see. The process is not immediate necessarily. There's one kind of thread in the eye of the needle that potentially could do it immediately, but more likely the DEA is going to, in my opinion, accept the FDA's recommendation, reschedule to 3, and issue a proposed rule. The proposed rule will then have a public comment period, potentially a hearing.
How does that work? When you say a proposed rule, how does that work? So
they would have a proposed rule simply rescheduling marijuana as it's defined in the Controlled Substances Act to Schedule 3.
So would you make the public announcement, and then once the public announcement is then made, you then shift to say that you're having this proposed rule? Yeah. Okay.
That's exactly right, Chad. That you issue the proposed rule, basically, like you give notice is what it is. You're giving notice that we're going to issue this final rule, and you give the public an opportunity to comment.
Yeah.
And if someone wants a hearing, you can ask for a hearing. The DEA has discretion, I believe, to grant or not grant a hearing.
That'll be the biggest selling point, because when you look at what's the approval rating for cannabis right now across the country? Is it 65%?
It's higher. I think the last Pew and Gallup both showed legalization at 68%.
Wow.
Shad, just so you know, the comment period is where the bill or the amendment is refined by industry peers. So we all get a chance to give our comments of where we think we're going to run into issues, and not and all that is considered, and it does take some time. Eric, I think it's typically no less than 6 months, but it can be 12-month comment period, and then another 1 or 2 years to implement it.
So the political cynics in us tend to look at this and suggest that perhaps the timing is geared to get this done before the presidential election.
Yes.
And so I suspect that's the intent. I will also say let's not underestimate our government's ability to screw it up.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So, I say that with some hesitation because I'm heading to DC to meet with some of our representatives tomorrow, and I mean no malice by that point, but I think it's just difficult to get things done in that environment.
Yeah. Well, the last election, as soon as obviously the Dems took control of the Senate, correct, Rob?
They maintain control.
They maintain control. And I think, before the midterms, it appeared that the Biden administration, the Dems, had obviously had everything passed when it came to, cannabis. This has fallen flat on its face. This has been put on a back burner. I've never seen something fumbled so bad, but you actually do believe there's some real substance there, that they indeed want to get this done before the next election.
I'm not saying it's going to get done. I'm saying that I could see that as an intent to do it. It makes sense to me, and the timing makes sense to me, knowing how long it takes to go through a comment period and that sort of thing. There's a lot of unknowns here. I want to make clear 100%. That a lot of what I'm saying is conjecture, but I'm
wish I never asked that question. There'll be times we get asked that every day, but no one knows the answer, right?
Yeah, but that's what my suspicion is.
Yeah. Well, listen, Rob, I know that through your network, you were able to obviously get us in touch with Eric. Eric, what an incredible source of information. I appreciate the two of you, probably the two smartest guys in cannabis, but really appreciate you checking in and providing some helpful information that'll give our viewers a better understanding as what can we expect next if rescheduling. Well, one, if rescheduling is going to happen, and if it is, what people can anticipate after that. But appreciate it. And as usual, let's please keep in touch and look forward to seeing you guys later this month in Chicago.
Thank you both.
All right. Thank you. So what'd you all think of the interview? Did you like what we recorded with our guests? Then leave a comment below and let us know what you thought of it. And if there's any more questions you want us to ask, as usual, share this video with your network. Click on that bell for all notifications. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel because we would not be here without you. Thanks for watching, everyone.